Thank you very much, Saburi-san and Takeuchi-san and all the participants joining us today. It is my great pleasure and honor to share some thoughts about a research project that I've been working on for many years and remains very relevant in today's international landscape. And that is to understand the economics of how sanctions have been working as a tool of economic statecraft and national security, with a special eye toward how it has impacted Russia starting in 2014-15 and more recently today. So I'm going to share my screen. So given that I only have about 40 minutes, I'm not going to be able to go through every single slide, but as Mr. Saburi said, please ask any questions in the chat room, and I will try and get to as many as I can. So today's presentation is going to be about the sword and the shield, measuring the impact of targeted sanctions. So just a quick disclaimer, while this is research that I conducted while I was at the State Department of State and actually continued since, these are my own personal views and not necessarily the official views of the US government. So I'm going to be focusing on the US and EU sanctions against Russia from 2014 to 2016 as a natural experiment to better understand how generally the economics of targeted sanctions work. I'll quick share some the summary of all my findings. What we do is our data, which is all the way down to the micro level, so the company and the individual level economic data, allows us to very precisely measure what the impact of a company or an individual becoming sanctioned does. And we find very large impacts upon the targets. On average, a company's revenue falls by a quarter. The asset valuation falls by 1/2. The number of employees falls by 1/3. I'll discuss more in detail how that impacts. We do also find some evidence of spillover onto companies that aren't sanctioned, but are related to the sanctioned companies. We also find more information about how these sanctions are working. In particular, we find that the channel by which sanctions are working seems to be by the denial of Western service inputs into the Russian production function. So we find that the impact is much greater for companies and business sectors that are dependent upon Western service inputs. And I think this is actually a very interesting and powerful finding. However, we also find that there is a subcategory of sanctioned targets that are shielded by the state through subsidies, bailouts, and other mechanisms. That makes sanctions appear misleadingly ineffective for some targets, but I would argue it actually causes us to underestimate what the true impact of sanctions are. And again, in the case of 2014 to 16, we estimate that the direct impact of the sanctioned targets has reduced Russian GDP by about 4.2% of GDP relative to pre-sanctions levels. But if you measure also the cost to the Russian government from protecting or shielding some of these companies, it actually goes as high as 7.5%. Of GDP. But I think this also has very important policy implications that I will talk about in more detail later. So that's the quick summary. Let me get now the beginning of the actual presentation. So as I'm sure many of you know, sanctions have been a very long-standing tool of economic statecraft. There are, as the commentator Takeuchi-san works on, the sanctions against North Korea, the sanctions against Cuba, Iran, Iraq, etc. However, what I think is most interesting today is a new class of sanctions called targeted sanctions, or some people call them smart sanctions, that instead of sanctioning an entire country, sanctions specific individuals, entities, or transactions. And this really sort of grew in popularity since the year 2000. The next slide kind of shows at least the total number of targeted sanctions since 2000, and this data only goes up to chart only goes up to 2021, but I'm sure in 2022 this has skyrocketed to over 10,000 designations. So as an economist, I would argue that since the nature of sanctions since 2000 has changed away from country-level macroeconomic sanctions to now more targeted microeconomic sanctions, the way we should try and understand and the economic tools and data we use to study them should also change from not just macroeconomic studies to microeconomic data and analysis. And that's what this paper is trying to do. So just a quick review again. I'm sorry, my mouse is very sensitive, so it's not easy to just control one slide at a time. Just a quick review for the types of sanctions we have. We have the blocking or restrictive sanctions, which basically prohibits any transaction between Western entities and the sanctions targets. Also, by the way, it's important to know that when a company gets targeted and put on a blacklist, all subsidiaries that are 50% or more owned by that target also get sanctioned. There's also restrictive and blocking sanctions on individuals, so not a company. And so on those individuals, basically the companies for which that person has an economic relationship with also becomes banned from having transactions. And then finally, there are sectoral sanctions, which basically prohibit some kinds of transactions like technology transfer or maritime insurance provision, but is not a blanket prohibition on all transactions. So how do we measure the economic impact of these sanctions? Again, before we could use macroeconomic data because the sanctions themselves were macroeconomic in nature. And I cited here a couple of famous papers and books that try and look at it. But again, I would argue that now it is more important than ever to try and go down to the microeconomic level. And this paper that I am talking about, we were able to declassify some data for specifically Russian companies in the 2014 to 16 timeframe that allows us to get a better insight into what's actually happening. Even so, there is big challenges to trying to measure what the economic impact is, because big macroeconomic effects are happening at the same time as these companies get sanctioned. So you might remember back in 2014, there was a big drop in the price of oil. So you don't want to confuse some negative performance of a company becoming sanctioned with the negative performance of the company because oil prices have fallen and the general macroeconomic performance of Russia has also fallen. More recently today, the oil price has risen. You don't want to confuse the impact of sanctions with the general macroeconomic benefit that Russia is enjoying from higher oil prices. So it's very important to try and disentangle the two. So what do we do? What we do is we use a database called Bureau van Dijk's Orbis database. This tracks over 400 million companies worldwide, including 18 million firms inside Russia. We link that to another database of 140 million individuals in LexisNexis World Compliance Database that tracks all of the web of relationships between individuals and firms. And so this is just a simple Venn diagram showing the number of companies that were sanctioned by the US and the EU from 2014 to 2016. This is the number of individuals that have been sanctioned by either the US or the EU. And I've divided them basically into the upper half, which I call political targets. Basically, these are individuals that we could not find in our LexisNexis database, and therefore they do not seem to have any economic relationship with an entity, while the people on the bottom are individuals that have business connections. So it's the companies also will get sanctioned if this individual gets sanctioned. And then lastly, there are the companies that are associated to these sanctioned individuals. And finally, there are the companies that received sectoral sanctions. Before I get to what we find, there's one final category of companies we need to consider. We were motivated by to look at this because while as I mentioned earlier, most of the sanctioned targets do seem to see a big decrease in their economic performance, there is a subcategory of companies that do not seem to be affected at all, which we thought was very strange. But then we looked at it more closely and we realized that they were getting protected or shielded by the Russian state. So there's a lot of news reports about how some sanctioned companies, after they got sanctioned, received tax breaks or a very big government contract or a loan guarantee. This has the effect, again, of immunizing these companies from the effect of sanctions, and this needs to also be controlled for. So here's one example of VTB Bank, which after it got sanctioned, received billions of dollars in state aid. Bank Russia is notoriously the personal bank of President Putin and his close advisors. And after it got sanctioned in 2014, it received a very rich electricity contract from the Russian government. And defense contractors have also received large state orders after it got sanctioned. So we need some way of deciding which companies that get sanctioned may receive protection from the Russian state. So what we do is we construct a list of what we call strategic firms by basically combining these three official lists. In the interest of time, I won't go through all three of them, but we can talk about them in the Q&A session afterward. So basically, out of the roughly 584 companies that got sanctioned in 2014 to 2016, about 40 of them we think are strategic out of 374 overall companies that we think are strategic to the Russian state. So remember the kind of 400 million kind of strong database, including 17 million companies in Russia. From there, we basically isolated the, out of the 584 sanctioned firms, we could actually find 545 of them in our database. We also found the around 2,000 or so firms that are associated with these sanctioned firms, their subsidiaries. And then the remainder of about 76,000 companies is a control group of companies that operate in the same business sector as the sanctioned companies, but did not get sanctioned, at least in 2014 to 2016. And what we can track is the firm performance in terms of their operating revenue, their total assets, and their number of employees. Also, we can track whether they're bankrupt or not, what country they're in, and again, what sector of business they're operating in. So let me just skip here. So what do we find? Again, we find that very powerful statistically significant effects of sanctions. After a firm gets sanctioned, on average, the firm has a 3% higher probability of bankruptcy. Operating revenue falls by 1/4. Total asset valuation falls by 1/2. The number of employees falls by 1/3. And because we have sector, country, time fixed effects, we are comparing sanctioned firms versus similar control group firms that operate in the same sector at the same time, but which did not get sanctioned. That's what allows us to control for any kind of macroeconomic effect, like oil prices or ruble, exchange rates or any other sort of macroeconomic effect. So naively extrapolating the cost of all of these sanctions, because after all, the aggregate sum of all of the revenue of every firm in an economy should also equal GDP, right? That's also national accounting. So just adding up what this 1/4 drop in all of the sanctioned companies are is about $95 billion, or about 4.2% of Russia's pre-sanctions 2013 GDP. And that's I would say a pretty big figure. It's actually somewhat larger than what some other studies suggest. Here's just the regression results. I'll skip this in the interest of time. Here is sort of the diagram we show. You can see how from 2013 to 2014, there's a very big negative impact from 2014, a little bit smaller and less of an impact in 15. And then by the time 2016 comes around, the effect is completely gone. As I'll show later, however, for the strategic firms, there's no statistical impact in 2014. The same negative impacts for total asset values, for employment, but also for the strategic firms, we see actually no statistical impact whatsoever. So, what kind of takeaways do we have from here? Well, first, just some quick caveats. If anything, we think our estimates is an underestimate of the actual impact because they're capturing the differential impact of a firm relative to its control group. But if the control group is also getting affected indirectly through sanctions, through things like de-risking and so on, then actually the overall macroeconomic impact is actually bigger than our extrapolation would suggest. And now here's, I think, perhaps one of the most interesting findings in the data. Once we control for whether a firm is strategic or not, we see very different impacts. So again, if a company is sanctioned, but it is also a strategic firm, then there is no impact from sanctions on their economic performance. In fact, the entire impact from operating revenue goes away. The impact on assets and employment is still there, but about half in magnitude to the original impact on non-strategic firms. So why are these companies seeing no economic impact? It's again because the Russian state is going in and bailing these companies out by transferring economic resources to them. But that transfer of resources doesn't come for free, right? It doesn't come from nowhere. It's a hurt. The hurt of the sanction is moving from the sanctioned firm to the Russian government, right? Because the Russian government has to bail out these sanctioned firms. So we need to include, I would argue, the cost of the bailout to the Russian government as well in measuring how impactful these sanctions are. So if we just naively add up the impact of protecting these firms just by adding up what their impact on operating revenue should be, this actually increases the overall lower estimate of how big sanctions have hurt Russia in 2014 and 15-16 to 7.5%. So ignoring the shielding effect underestimates the overall impact of sanctions by around half. So it's we think, a very important phenomenon to keep track of. Now, the other, I think, very interesting finding is how these sanctions are working. So when you think back on theoretically why sanctions work, there's two possible mechanisms by which sanctions can impact a firm. Number one is it may be unable to export its goods to Western markets, right? But I think in the case of Russia, at least, that's not as important an impact because Russia's economy mainly exports oil and gas to the West, and that both in 2014 to 16 and actually even today is not being as sanctioned. There's less restrictions on selling oil and gas and hydrocarbons and other commodities to the West. And I can also argue that even if they were sanctioned, the oil market at least is globally integrated and fungible, so it doesn't matter whether it actually gets sanctioned or not. The other impact by which sanctions can hurt the firm is by denying Western service inputs into the Russian company. So you either are stopping them from selling to the West or you're stopping them from buying from the West. So we thought that what should happen is the companies that are more dependent upon Western inputs should be more vulnerable to sanctions. That's what we thought. So we went to try and test that. We tried to see, is a company that is in a sector that is more dependent upon Western inputs, does that mean that the impact of sanctions becomes bigger? The short answer is no, not exactly. when you just look at gross inputs from the West, like the gross value added for US and EU, it's in things like computer, electronics and equipment and rubber products and things like that. Actually, this does not seem to have a statistically significant relationship. But if you just focus on those companies that import Western services from the West, they're more dependent not on gross Western inputs, but Western service inputs. There we find a very big economic relationship. So what's happening is the real mechanism is not so much that they are being hurt by denying any Western input from the West. If it's, I don't know, like some kind of, electronic equipment or something, and the Russian company can find a substitute from China or India or some other company. Maybe it's not as high quality, but if they can find some substitute, they're not that impacted. But only in those inputs that are key high technologies or services where there really is no substitute for the West, that's where the sanctions really seems to hurt. So let me get to the policy implications, because I think this is what everyone wants to hear, and I'm about halfway through my time, so this is good. So policy implications, number one. Targeted sanctions, i.e. smart sanctions, I think there's strong statistical and empirical evidence that they are smart and they are impactful. They do seem to concentrate economic harm on the targets themselves. However, they could still be smarter. We find evidence of some spillover onto non-sanctioned firms. We should also remember that this is not costless to the West either. Right. This is by disconnecting an economic relationship between the West and Russia. It hurts Russian companies, but it also hurts Western companies as well. And not just through the denial of Western sales to Russia, but also through the burden of implementing all of these sanctions. I've worked both in the public sector and in the private sector, and at many large investment banks in the US as well. And I can say that it's actually very expensive for these banks to try and implement compliance procedures to comply with sanctions. There's some estimates that suggest that US and European banks are paying anywhere between $25 and $83 billion per year to try and implement sanctions. So this is a major cost, and something I think that policymakers should think about. There's also, I think, evidence that there's some knock-on effects on third parties. Some Western banks, because it's so difficult to comply with sanctions, I think are de-risking from certain regions entirely. So, for example, in places in the Caribbean, in the Pacific Islands, in fragile states in Africa, it's so costly to try and comply with targeted sanctions regimes that they decide just to leave the market entirely. And this has damaging effects for financial inclusion in those companies. The IMF has done a lot of research recently showing how correspondent banking relationships in these underfinanced countries are dropping because of sanctions. So that's an unintended sort of third consequence. Another, I think, policy implication is that because often this is occurring through the private sector channel, even though it's the government that decides who gets sanctioned, this stickiness in the sanctions can weaken the incentive to change economic behavior. So, for example, the West has tried to sanction Russia both for its initial illegal invasion of Crimea and the Donbass, and now this much more severe military escalation and aggression in Ukraine. And sometimes when I talk to policymakers, the idea seems to be we're going to sanction Russian companies to punish them, but it also is trying to change their incentive. It's trying to cause them to change their behavior by saying, we sanction you because you invaded Ukraine. If you change your behavior and you stop invading Ukraine and you pull out of Ukraine, then you're going to benefit because we're going to de-sanction you. But if it's the private sector that is implementing the sanctions, And the private sector says, you know what, it's just so complicated complying with these sanctions that I'm just not going to go back to Russia anyways, even if it doesn't get sanctioned. Then there's no economic incentive for the original Russian target to change its behavior. We can equally sort of suggest this for North Korea or for Iran. Iran, at least during the JCPOA negotiations, was promised some sanctions relief in return for signing the JCPOA. I think Iran was quite disappointed to find that despite some technically sanctions relief, they actually didn't get very much economic benefit because Western companies said, well, it's still so dangerous investing in Iran that we're not going to go back. So again, this sanction stickiness doesn't really improve the incentive effect of sanctions. Other policy implications. As I mentioned, our data suggests that the way sanctions work is by denying key Western technologies and services. So as long as the Western companies are dominant in these sectors, whether the provision of financial services, maritime insurance, or high technology microchips, or whatever dominant sort of industry, then that's why sanctions work, because they have a quasi-monopolistic position in these key sectors. So if a Russian target gets sanctioned, they have no alternative except buying from Western companies. But sanctions, of course, reduces Western competitiveness in these sectors, right? Both directly because of the burden of compliance, but also because once you sanction a country, they are incentivized to try and develop alternatives and substitutes for these sectors. So I think it's important to, when thinking about and designing sanctions policy, not to just think about who we sanction, but also how we can make sure that sanctions remains an important tool by continuing to focus on the improving and maintaining the competitiveness of Western companies in these key sectors. Because the moment Western companies are no longer the key suppliers for technologies or for services, and there's a better alternative from, for example, China, then Western sanctions are no longer impactful. So I think in terms of sanctions policy, ideally, it should try and focus on reducing the burden upon Western private sector in complying with these sanctions. And I have a lot of ideas that I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A session on how we can become more transparent and data-driven, use new tools like AI and machine learning. And I also would argue that the sanctions policy process can use more economists, speaking in a self-serving manner, because economists and statisticians and data scientists can help design the sanctions to make them most impactful upon the target while least damaging to Western economies. One myth that I often hear is that sanctions are powerful only as long as the US dollar remains the dominant currency. That's not exactly true. There's nothing stopping someone from using US dollars for illicit activity. The US dollar dominance is really just a symptom of just how competitive the US financial sector is. But you can easily do lots of sanctionable activity using US dollars. So it's not about US dollar dominance. It's about Western financial sector dominance. Other policy implications, relative dependency matters, right? When you're trying to decide who has more powerful sanctions tools, you have to think who is more dependent upon the other and who has more substitutes than the other, right? So Russia has counter-sanctioned much of Western companies as well, but because Russia, is dominant export is fungible commodities like hydrocarbons and minerals and agricultural commodities, those are perfectly substitutable with other products from other countries. while there's no real alternative for, a high-tech, NVIDIA graphics chip from the US, or some great, robotic high-precision instrument from Japan. So that's why Western sanctions work against Russia, but Russian counter-sanctions against the West don't really work. Another policy lesson, I believe, is that multilateral sanctions kind of obviously work better than unilateral sanctions. And so it's pretty heartwarming for me to see just how strong and unified the Western response has been to the recent Russian aggression in Ukraine. Now, moving on to the shielding aspect, this is, I think, very important. You should not sanction a target necessarily with the expectation that that target is going to get damaged. Yes, all else equal, I think our data suggests that the target will get damaged. But if it's an important target to the Russian regime, then the Russian regime is going to try and protect it. So it's going to transfer resources to try and bail it out, and therefore you might not see any negative impact upon the target at all. But I think actually you could argue that that's a good thing, right? If you're trying to actually ultimately hurt the Russian regime, it's good that you're forcing the Russian regime to in a costly way move resources to try and bail out that strategic target, right? But again, we should remember that always the Russian state has the option to bail out its sanctioned targets. So they're not smart sanctions the way I think they were initially hoped to be. But it changes the definition of what we mean by success again, right? Is it a tactical goal of trying to hurt the target, or is it a strategic goal of trying to hurt the underlying regime? And again, I think if we are talking about targeting shielded targets that ultimately get strategic and therefore get shielded, maybe that's actually part of the objective. That means that we're actually hurting something that Putin's regime cares about so much that they actually, move resources to try and protect them. So actually, from the perspective of trying to maximize strategic impact upon the regime, you should only target strategic targets, right? But with shielding, authoritarian regimes can smart sanctions, right? You can try and hurt the oligarchs, or you can try and hurt just certain key companies. But if it's an authoritarian regime that has full power over how resources get allocated within the state, then you must accept the reality that your adversary can unsmart your sanctions by moving resources around to protect its elite and really just, damage the broader populace. But even that may sound like a pessimistic conclusion, but even that I think is better than the original countrywide sort of embargoes, right? Someone might say, well, if it's going to hurt the Russian taxpayer or the North Korean ordinary people, then what's the point of smart sanctions versus countrywide embargoes? Well, it's still different because in the one case, the Western sanctions are directly hurting the Russian people or the North Korean people. In the other case, we're not trying to directly hurt the Russian people. It's the Russian state that is taking resources away from the Russian people and bailing out its elite. So I think the smart sanctions or targeted sanctions strategy should be combined with good soft power, with good messaging and communication to point out that to the Russian people that, look, it is not the West that is hurting you. It is your government that is choosing to take money away from you through tax dollars or by taking your pension plan money or whatever to bail out these oligarchs. So you should think even harder about whether the regime is ultimately in your interest or not. Okay, now just some final quick words in the last 5 minutes I've got to talk about the more recent sort of sanctions episode. So unfortunately, this is the previous study was from 2014 to 16, where I have all this very detailed data. I don't have as detailed data for this most recent round of sanctions now. I hope to soon. But it's clear that in this most recent round, the number of sanctions that have targets that have been sanctioned has, in the case of U.S., more than doubled since 2014 episode. So we've seen an even larger proliferation of sanctions. So I think there's an increasingly blurry line between whether we are now working on in still a targeted sanctions paradigm or whether we're working on a countrywide embargo or not. I think also what is very relevant today is, again, the understanding that while it's the government that chooses the sanctions policy, it is the private sector that actually implements the sanctions. And there's been a lot of reporting of how there's been self-sanctioning by private companies, even companies that do not have to disconnect its relationship with Russia are doing so anyways because of reputational risk or because of compliance costs or whatever. So that is magnifying the impact of sanctions beyond officially what the Western governments have chosen to do. And that is not necessarily, I would argue, a good thing. There's been a lot of talk in the news about energy sanctions against Russia. I have some articles and op-eds out recently that argue that that's almost useless. Especially oil sanctions are just useless. Again, oil markets are fungible and globally integrated. So any sanctions against them, all they do is just redivert flows and make middlemen and arbitrageurs more profits. But really, there's no way that you can directly damage Russian oil revenue through this. So happy to talk about that more, but I argue that the right way to actually hurt Russian oil revenue in the short term is to tariff Russian oil imports. This is in the short term. In the medium term, the sanctioning and loss of key technology and investments from the West in Russian oil and gas supply is going to hurt their production supply in the medium term. But that's a medium-term effect, not a short-term effect. Again, I emphasize that it's very important to try and maintain the monopolistic position of key technology and financial services by the West. I think a great success has been the freezing of Russian central bank and other official assets in the West. I think it's actually very strange, maybe not strange, but it was a very big mistake by the Russian government that I guess the people that decided upon the invasion did not tell the Russian central bank that they were going to do this. And so the Russian central bank left a lot of its reserves in the West to be easily seized by Western authorities. In the future, I think any country, a smarter country that knows it's going to get sanctions for doing something is probably going to try and take the money out from the West before trying to invest in this. But, we should also recognize that even as the sanctions have ramped up dramatically in terms of the number of sanctions since 2014 to 16 experience, there's a limit to how far sanctions can go. I mean, the ultimate limit of where smart sanctions can go is to target every single entity in Russia. That pretty much is the same thing as a countrywide embargo. And we have seen examples of countries like Cuba or especially North Korea that have pretty much been cut off from all trade with the West for decades now, and the regime still survives. So we should be realistic about what targeted sanctions can and cannot do. When I hear people say, will sanctions against Russia bring down the Russian economy? The short answer is no. It's not possible to do that. It proved impossible even for a small, very resource-poor country, not resource-poor, but a small country like North Korea. So how can you expect, if it can't work for a country like North Korea, how can it work for a much larger and much more resource-rich country like Russia? That's just not realistic. Okay, with that, I think I'm right on time. I'll just share some thoughts about future work, but I will now pass it over back to Saburi-san. Thank you very much for listening.